My name is Anna de Armas, and I'm 27 years old. 6 months ago, my cousin pulled me aside in a sacristy 10 minutes before my sister's wedding and told me something that made me understand my entire family had been built on a lie so deliberate, so calculated, that I had to spend 3 hours standing next to people who had erased me while maintaining a smile so steady my face ached afterward. And then I watched it all collapse when the truth found its own way out, not because I forced it, but because lies have an expiration date. They just don't advertise it. Let me start where it actually begins, not at the wedding, years before. I was the daughter nobody photographed, not because I was invisible, I was very present, always there, but because I operated in the space between visibility and erasure. My sister Lucia was the one with the laugh that filled rooms. She was the one our parents photographed at 17, at 22, at every milestone moment. She was the one they'd say, "You're so talented, Mija, you could do anything." And she would smile, and that smile would end up framed on the mantel next to our father's medical diplomas. I was the quiet one who learned to play piano at 5, who won first chair in the regional orchestra at 13, who got into the prestigious conservatory program at 18. But these achievements existed in the margins of our family's narrative. They were nice, they were fine, they were not the centerpiece of dinner table conversation. Those belonged to Lucia, who had changed majors 3 times, who had gotten fired from 2 jobs, who somehow made failure look like an adventure and success like luck. The piano was my language because words in my house had always belonged to someone more fluent in the art of being loved. I practiced 4 hours a day. My teacher, Dr. Castillo, would sometimes stay after lessons just to talk to me. He was a man in his 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of hands that had played at La Scala. "Anna," he said to me one afternoon when I was 19, "your fingers don't just play notes, they tell stories. You have to be careful with a gift like that because people will listen, and listening changes them." That's when I decided to become a music therapist, not a concert pianist, not a teacher, but someone who could use sound as medicine. I wanted to be the person in the room that nobody photographed but everyone needed. My parents nodded when I told them. My mother said, "How nice for you." My father asked if the salary was stable. Lucia, who was home for the weekend, laughed and said, "God, Anna, you're such a fixer, you can't save everyone." But I could try. I got my degree. I started volunteering at a psychiatric hospital while completing my certification. I moved into a small apartment 2 hours north of home and began building something that was mine, not remarkable, not dinner table material, but real and mine. That's when Lucia started asking questions about my life. She'd call in the middle of the afternoon, which was unusual. Lucia didn't call people, generally speaking. She operated under a philosophy that other people should make the effort to maintain her. But she called me and she asked about my clients. Which hospital? What kind of work? Was I making enough money? How did they select people for the program? Did I work with other music therapists? Was there a supervising doctor? I answered all of it. I was thrilled, honestly. This was the first time my sister seemed genuinely interested in something I was doing. I was feeding her ammunition, as I would later understand it, but then I thought she was feeding me connection. Dr. Castillo had warned me about this too in his oblique way. The people who ask the most questions are sometimes the people who are listening for weaknesses instead of listening for truth. 3 months into my first real position at Riverside Psychiatric Hospital, my mother called. Her voice was different, sharp like the edge of something clinical. "We need to talk about your job," she said. "Okay," I said, "what about it?" Lucia mentioned something. She said you've been working with vulnerable patients, that you might not have the proper credentials, that the hospital might not know your background. Every cell in my body went cold. "What, Mom, my credentials are fine, I'm certified, the hospital has my documentation." Lucia said she called the hospital to check on something for a friend, and they seemed confused about whether you were actually licensed. Lucia called my hospital. I can still hear the silence on the other end of that line. The silence before she said, "Is there something you're not telling us about your work, Anna?" The thing about someone believing a lie about you is that it doesn't matter how fast you correct it. The corruption happens in the moment between the lie and the truth. My mother had already accepted the version where I was incompetent. She had already made me real in that narrative before I could even tell her it was false. I didn't yell, I explained. I sent her the official documentation from the licensing board. I asked her to call the hospital directly, not through Lucia but herself. I emailed her the details of my continuing education credits. 14 emails over 5 days. Each one was met with polite distance. Each one was like pressing against a door that had already locked. My father called on the 6th day. He didn't ask if the accusations were true. He asked if I knew how disappointed he was that I would let our family be concerned about me. He said, "You've embarrassed us, Anna. With people asking questions about your qualifications, it makes us look bad, and we've always done right by you." The line went dead after that, not emotionally, literally. He hung up. Then came the revelation that would reshape everything. Lucia had never called the hospital. She had never done any of this. I found out 3 months later, after extensive damage had already been done, after my mother had repeated this story to their friends, after my father had mentioned it in professional circles, all framed as concern, as worry about their daughter's stability. I found out because Dr. Castillo, who knew someone at the hospital, heard about it and asked me point blank if it was true. It wasn't true, it was complete fiction. Lucia had fabricated the entire thing. What she had done was identify the exact moment when I was becoming something. I was 23 years old, building a career, gaining confidence, becoming visible in a way that didn't involve her. And she couldn't have that. My parents couldn't have that either, I realize now. Because if I was competent and successful, it created questions about why Lucia, with all her talent and opportunity and love, was still meandering through life. If I could build something real, their narrative about who deserved their attention and belief and pride had to be rewritten. It's easier to believe a daughter who has disappointed you is lying than to examine why you've chosen to keep believing in the daughter who keeps disappointing you. I tried to fix it. I called 14 times. My mother answered once and told me she needed time to process. My father's number was blocked by the 4th call. I sent a certified letter with copies of my credentials. It was returned unopened. I asked my Aunt Magdalena to talk to them. She came back with the message that they needed me to be honest about what happened, not that they needed verification, they needed me to confess to something I hadn't done. I understand now what was happening. They had already written their story, and I was the author of my own abandonment for insisting on a different narrative. Dr. Castillo became my family during that time. He'd have me to his apartment on Sundays. He'd cook, and we'd listen to recordings of obscure pianists, and he'd tell me about the time he almost lost everything. A competing musician had spread rumors about his stability, his sexuality, his ethics, and how he'd learned that some people only believe the versions of you that confirm their existing fears. "But you survived it," I said. "I survived it," he agreed. "But not because the truth came out. It came out, yes, eventually, but by then a lot of time had passed. What saved me was building something regardless, music that mattered, relationships with people who chose to believe in me, a life that wasn't dependent on my family's narrative." He died 3 years ago. Cancer, swift and decisive. He left me his collection of recordings and a letter that said, "Your story isn't over, don't let their ending become yours." I buried myself in work. I got promoted to senior music therapist within 5 years. I started consulting on music therapy programs for other psychiatric hospitals. I published a paper on the efficacy of structured improvisation in treating trauma. Dr. Castillo became right. I built something regardless. My life became full of meaning that didn't require anyone's permission or recognition. But I never called home, not after the final blocked number, not after the returned letter. I sent Christmas cards, birthday cards, small gestures that cost me nothing but required them to make a choice about what they'd do with them. My father had a heart attack on a Tuesday in October. The hospital called me because I was still listed as an emergency contact. They hadn't updated it even after 8 years of silence. That detail alone nearly broke me. They had carried me as an option the entire time they were removing me from the story. He was stable but required surgery. There was a complication with one of the arteries, and they needed to do a cardiac catheterization immediately. The surgeon's name was Dr. Vasquez, and when I arrived at the hospital, she pulled me aside in the ICU corridor before I went to see him. "Your father is going to be fine," she said, "but there's something you should know before you go in there." That's when everything inverted. Dr. Vasquez had been in the same cardiac program as my father decades ago. She remembered him as someone brilliant, driven, someone with real promise. She also remembered him talking about a daughter who was going to be a therapist, who was going to do important work. "He was so proud of you," Dr. Vasquez said. "He brought in your scholarship letter, showed it to everyone." I remembered thinking he was one of those rare men who actually saw his daughter's potential. "He blocked my number," I said. Dr. Vasquez's expression shifted. "What do you mean?" I told her. All of it. 8 years compressed into the corridor outside my father's surgical suite, with machines beeping and nurses moving around us like we weren't having a conversation that was rewriting history. "His sister called me," Dr. Vasquez said quietly. 2 years ago. She was looking for you, said something had happened, that your family had made a mistake. I told her I had no way to find you. I assumed you didn't want contact." My cousin, the one who pulled me aside before Lucia's wedding 6 months ago. I went in to see my father. He was smaller in the hospital bed than I remembered. His chest was wrapped. There were IV lines, monitoring wires, a blood pressure cuff cycling every 15 minutes. He opened his eyes when I came to the bedside. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then I reached for his hand and he let me take it. "Hi, Dad," I said. He started crying, which is something I had never seen my father do. The monitors all spiked. A nurse moved toward us, but I waved her off. I let him cry. I didn't cry. I had done most of my crying in the 8 years he had decided I was a problem to be solved rather than a daughter to be known. "I was wrong," he said. "Your mother told me about Lucia. She finally told me the truth." Here's what nobody talks about with apologies. They can destroy you as much as the original wounds. Because an apology that comes 8 years late means 8 years of deciding you weren't worth the effort of truth. I stayed with him through the surgery. I sat in the waiting room with my mother, who looked older and smaller, who kept saying "I'm sorry" in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away. Lucia didn't show up until the second day. She walked into my father's hospital room, saw me sitting there, and the color drained from her face. "Lana." I didn't stand up, I didn't move. I just looked at her, and I could see the moment she understood that I knew, not guessed. Knew. The calculations moved across her face. What could she still get away with? What story could she reframe? What angle could still work? "We need to talk," she said. "No," I said calmly. "We don't. The time for talking was 8 years ago, when you decided to lie about my qualifications to our parents. The time for talking was any of the 7 years that followed, when the truth could have come out, and my father could have apologized while he was still capable of it without recovering from cardiac surgery." My mother was standing in the doorway. She was crying. Lucia turned to her and said, "Mom, this isn't fair. I was young. I was going through something I didn't know it would." "Go," I said. "Actually, don't let me go. I've done enough talking in this family." I left the hospital. I drove to a hotel and I sat in a room with the curtains drawn, and I did the thing I hadn't let myself do in 8 years. I grieved. Not for my father's heart attack, not for my mother's tears, but for the time I would never get back, for the promotion my father didn't see, for the patients I had helped that he never knew about, for the person I became without needing him to watch it happen. The cousin who had told me the truth, Father Michael, who was performing Lucia's wedding, he came to find me. It took him 3 days. He sat on the edge of my hotel bed and said, "I should have told you earlier. Your father asked me not to. He said it was his place to tell you, and then he didn't know how, and then time just passed." "Why tell me at all?" I asked. "Because I watched your mother break under the weight of that secret. Because your father looked at every young woman in his hospital ward like he was trying to see you. Because Lucia is drowning in it, and nobody can save her but yourself. And because you deserve to know that you were right, that you had always been right." It should have felt like a victory. It should have felt like vindication. Instead, it felt like holding a glass of water that arrived so late that I'd already learned to exist without drinking. My mother came to see me 2 weeks later, not with Lucia. Alone, she looked like someone who had been excavating her own story and not liking what she found. "I believed her because it was easier than believing in you," my mother said. She didn't sit down. She just stood at the door like she expected me to throw her out, which I almost did. "I believed her because if you were really as capable as your accomplishments suggested, then the fact that we had abandoned you said something about us that I wasn't ready to know." "And now?" I asked. "Now I know it anyway," she said, "and I have to live with it." She left her number on the table. She left without waiting for me to call her back, without waiting for forgiveness, which I appreciated in a way that surprised me. It took 3 months. That was how long I needed to think about whether I wanted to rebuild something or let it stay in the past where it belonged. Dr. Castillo had been right. The truth doesn't save you automatically. It just changes what you're building from. I could build toward my family or I could keep building without them, but I couldn't do both with my full self. One had to be secondary, chosen, conditional. I called my father first. He was home from the hospital in cardiac rehab, learning to live in his body again. When he heard my voice, he was silent. "I'm not ready to pretend this was okay," I said. "I'm not ready for family dinners or pictures or people asking what happened, but I'm willing to figure out what's true between us now if you are." "I am," he said, "whatever that takes." The first meeting was uncomfortable in the precise way that healing usually is. We met at a cafe, not at home. My mother came. We sat at a table and nobody pretended the last 8 years hadn't happened. My father talked about what he had done. My mother talked about what she had allowed. They both acknowledged that I was under no obligation to forgive them, that forgiveness wasn't even the goal, accountability was. "What do you need from us?" my father asked. "I need to know that you see me," I said. "Not the daughter you imagined, not the daughter Lucia made me into, me, as I actually am." He cried again. My mother reached across the table, and I let her take my hand, but I didn't hold back. I just let her hold what I offered, which was presence without permission. Lucia apologized 6 months later. She did it in therapy first in front of her therapist and then in person in my apartment. She looked different than I expected. Smaller, less calculated. She told me what I had already figured out, that she was terrified of me succeeding because it meant she had no excuse for not succeeding, that undermining me had felt like the only way to make sense of her own stagnation, that she had spent the last 9 years watching me build something real while she was still trying to rewrite the narrative of her own life. "I don't know how to forgive you," I said. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to, I'm asking you to let me try to be different." And that's when the rebuilding actually started. It wasn't because she apologized. It was because I decided to let her try. There was a difference. It's been 3 years since my father's heart attack. We have dinner once a month. It's not perfect. There are still conversations I avoid. There are still moments when I catch my father looking at me like he's calculating the time he lost, and it hurts to see that math on his face. My mother has been in therapy. Lucia has been in therapy. They've all become people who are capable of acknowledging damage, which is not forgiveness, but it's the foundation that forgiveness could theoretically be built on. But here's the thing about surviving your family's erasure of you. It changes what you require from people. I have learned that love without seeing me is not love I need to accept. I have learned that presence without consistency is not family. I have learned that the word sorry doesn't repair time, but it can be the beginning of a different relationship. I still work at Riverside. I still see patients. I still consult on programs. I still have my apartment, my life, my carefully constructed existence that doesn't need anyone's narrative to be true. The only difference is that now there are people in my life who are working towards seeing me. Not perfectly, not always successfully, but they're trying. My father goes to every lecture I give. He sits in the back and takes notes like he's still that young doctor who talked about his brilliant daughter to everyone who would listen. My mother learned to play the piano at 62 years old, and she's terrible at it, and she practices 3 times a week. Lucia became a social worker, which is what she should have been doing the entire time instead of managing everyone else's narratives. I should resent them for this late arrival. Sometimes I do. But Dr. Castillo taught me something that took years to understand. The power isn't in being right about what happened. The power is in choosing what happens next. The power is in deciding whether you're going to let someone else's timing determine your wholeness. My name is Ana de Arma and I'm 27 years old. I'm a senior music therapist. I have published papers. I have helped people find their way back to themselves through sound and presence. I have built a life that stands on its own. I have a family that is trying to see me, and I am learning to let them, carefully with boundaries, with the full knowledge of what they're capable of. And I have learned that survival isn't about waiting for the person who hurt you to change. It's about becoming who you were always meant to be regardless of whether they ever notice. The truth doesn't expire. Sometimes it takes 8 years, sometimes it takes longer, but it always finds its way out. The question is whether you've built something strong enough to stand in the light when it finally arrives. I have, and if you're still waiting for your family to see you, stop waiting. That's the real truth. See yourself first.